The air in the habitation suite was a perfect, sterile lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and held the temperature at a constant, unnoticeable coolness against Elian's skin. It was the taste of absence, the scent of control. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling plate glass window, a transparent wall that separated his gilded cage from the sprawling, silent geometry of the Consolidated Directorate's upper sector. Below, the city was a circuit board of light, its traffic flowing in silent, orderly rivers of white and crimson. He could see it all, touch none of it. The glass was cool and unyielding beneath his fingertips, a familiar and constant barrier. He was an artifact in a museum, displayed for an audience that was never physically present, but always watching. Cameras, nearly invisible in their recessed housings, tracked his every minute movement. Biosensors, woven into the very fabric of his clothing, monitored his heart rate, his respiration, his hormonal balance. He was the most meticulously curated specimen in the Directorate. He was the son of Chairman Vance, a genetic treasure, a recessive Omega, whose bloodline was a political currency more valuable than any mineral or technology. He was not a person. He was an asset. The thought was a smooth, worn stone in his mind, turned over and over until it had no sharp edges left. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, a pale, slender silhouette against the city's electric constellations. He saw the fine-boned structure of his face, the wide, watchful eyes that seemed too large for it, the soft curve of a mouth that rarely smiled. He looked like something fragile, something made of porcelain and moonlight, and he despised it. He despised the quiet compliance his body projected, the way it belied the screaming chaos that sometimes thrummed just beneath his skin. A soft chime, melodic and unobtrusive, echoed through the suite. It was the sound of an arrival, his new keeper. The last one had been removed 3 days ago for a protocol violation, a term so vague it was meaningless. Elian had seen the violation. Guard Orson had made the mistake of looking at him with something akin to pity. Pity was an unregulated emotion. It was a flaw in the machinery. The door to the suite slid open with a whisper of compressed air. The man who entered was not like the others. The previous guards had been large, functional, their presence more like furniture than humanity. This one was different. He was tall, built with the stark, efficient lines of a weapon, but it was the stillness in him that commanded the air. He moved with a predatory grace that was utterly silent, his black Aegis Corps uniform absorbing the soft light of the room. He stopped precisely 10 feet away, the regulation distance, but the space between them felt charged, compressed. Elian Vance, the man said. His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly timbre that seemed to scratch at the sterile quiet. Was not a question. It was a statement of inventory. I am Commander Kalen Rusk. I have been assigned as your prime security detail. Elian turned slowly from the window, schooling his features into the placid neutrality that was expected of him. He met the commander's eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, a deep, turbulent gray, and they held no pity. They held nothing at all. They were chips of granite, assessing, cataloguing. His gaze swept over Elian, clinical and dismissive, as if he were scanning a piece of cargo. Kalen Rusk. He knew the name. Whispers in the data streams his father allowed him to access. The commander was a legend in the Aegis Corps, a specialist in high-risk extractions and pacification campaigns in the outer territories. He was a tool of brutal efficiency, the Directorate's sharpest edge. What was he doing here? Babysitting a political pawn. "Commander," Elian acknowledged, his own voice soft, cultured, a perfect modulation of polite deference. He gave a slight inclination of his head. It was part of the performance, the submissive Omega, the dutiful son. Kale's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Then his expression was blank once more. He did a slow, deliberate sweep of the room, his eyes missing nothing. The sealed ventilation ducts, the pressure-sensitive flooring, the faint shimmer of the kinetic barrier outside the window. His presence changed the very atmosphere of the suite. The sterile air now felt thin, stretched taut over a low, humming current of energy that emanated from him. It was power, not the political power of his father, which was abstract and distant, but something primal, physical. It was the power of a wolf tasked with guarding a lamb, and the lamb was unsure if the wolf was there to protect it from the world or to protect the world from it. Elian felt a tremor, a tiny, unwelcome shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the response of his own biology, long slumbering and heavily suppressed, recognizing a predator, an alpha. Not just any alpha, but one whose control was so absolute it was a physical force. He could not smell him. The suite's purifiers and his own mandatory neutralizer patch saw to that. But he could feel him. It was like standing next to a dormant volcano. "The parameters of my assignment are absolute," Kyle said, his voice cutting through Elian's thoughts. He was speaking to the room, to the listening devices, as much as to Elian. "I will ensure your safety and well-being in accordance with Directorate Protocol 7. Your schedule will remain unchanged. My presence is non-negotiable and continuous. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elian said, the words feeling like dust in his mouth. He did understand. He was a package, and this was his new handler. The packaging had simply been upgraded to something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The commander's eyes met his again, and for a heartbeat, Elian felt stripped bare, as if those grey eyes could see past the porcelain doll and into the screaming, frantic thing trapped inside. He saw the boy who traced the constellations through the glass, who dreamt of the smell of real rain and the feeling of dirt beneath his feet. He saw the rage, the despair, the desperate, clawing yearning for a life that was not this one. Then the moment passed. The commander's face was a mask of professional indifference. He turned his head slightly, his ear pressed to a sub-vocal comms unit Elian couldn't see. "Prime is secure. Perimeter established. Maintain level 4 vigilance." He was a machine, functioning within his programming. Elian was his charge, a line of code in his mission directive. He was not a person, he was a job, and yet, as Kalen Rask stood there, a monolith of controlled force in the center of Elian's world, the sterile, predictable silence of the cage felt different. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. The silence now had a heartbeat, low and steady and dangerous. Elian turned back to the window, to the city of lights that promised a world he would never know. He rested his forehead against the cold glass, the faint vibration of the building's life support a distant hum. He had a new guard, a new cage. But the bars, he suspected, had just become terrifyingly real. The assignment was an insult, wrapped in the language of honor. Commander Kalen Rask stood in the gleaming, white-on-white transit tube, the city blurring past the maglev carriage's viewport into streaks of sterile light. The briefing file had been transmitted directly to his neural lace, downloading in cold, efficient packets of data. Subject: Elian Vance. Designation: Omega, recessive strain. Status: high-value political asset. Mission: prime security detail. It was a babysitting job, a gilded prison wardenship for the chairman's delicate son. After years spent on the bleeding edges of the directorate's influence, quelling insurrections on frost-bitten moons and dismantling syndicates in the corrosive anarchy of the underspires, he was being reassigned to this, to a climate-controlled penthouse and a charge whose only threat was boredom. He clenched his jaw, the muscle bunching beneath the skin. Control. It was the first and last lesson drilled into every Aegis Alpha. Control your instincts. Control your temper. Control your environment. Emotion was a liability. Sentiment was a weakness. His biology, the primal alpha core of him that screamed for dominance and territory, was a tool to be managed, not a master to be served. It was a weapon he could deploy, a current he could channel, but he was always the one holding the switch. Always. The transit tube decelerated with a soft hiss, docking with the Vance spire. The doors opened onto a private vestibule, the air already scrubbed and filtered, smelling of absolutely nothing. He despised it. The scentless environments of the elite felt like sensory deprivation, a deliberate severing of a fundamental connection to the world. On the frontier, scent told you everything: the coming storm, the fear of an enemy, the location of water. Here, it told you only that you were under control. He ascended in a private lift, the pressure shifting almost imperceptibly. His predecessor, Orson, had been removed for emotional compromise. Kyle had read the unabridged incident report. The man had offered the Omega a blanket during a media transmission because he'd thought the boy looked cold. A simple, human gesture. A catastrophic failure of protocol. The system did not reward humanity. It punished deviation. Kyle would not make that mistake. He entered the suite, and the first thing he registered was the boy, Elian Vance. He was standing by the window, a fragile silhouette against a backdrop of manufactured stars. The file's biometric data did not do him justice. The scans had shown his height, weight, bone density. They had not captured the unnerving stillness of him, the sense of a vibrant, complex life force being deliberately and systematically suppressed. He turned, and Kyle's internal systems, the cold calculus that had kept him alive for 2 decades, did a threat assessment out of pure reflex. No threat detected. The subject was slight, his posture broadcasting submission. But his eyes were not submissive. They were old, weary, and filled with a sharp, intelligent light that cut through the placid facade. They were the eyes of a prisoner who had memorized every crack in his cell wall. Kyle delivered his introductory statement, the words rote, mechanical. He catalogued the boy's reaction, the slight, almost invisible flinch at the sound of his voice, the perfect, practiced deference of his nod. He was a performer, and a good one. He played his part well. But Kale had spent his life reading the tells others missed, the subtle tension in a hand, the fractional shift in breathing. He could see the defiance coiled deep inside Elian Vance, tight and dangerous as a compressed spring. This was not a simple protection detail. It was a containment protocol. His job was to ensure the spring did not break. He made his report to his perimeter team, his voice clipped and impersonal. He was aware of the boy watching him, his gaze a physical weight on the back of his neck. Kyle began his own sweep of the suite, his movements economical and precise. He tested the seals on the windows, ran a diagnostic on the atmospheric scrubbers, checked the encrypted comms panel. Every system was state-of-the-art, designed to create a hermetically sealed world, a beautiful, sterile prison. He stopped before a small, recessed alcove containing a single, perfect white orchid in a ceramic pot. The plant was real, an anomaly in this world of synthetic perfection. Its scent should have been a soft, floral note in the air, but the purifiers were too efficient. It was a flower with no fragrance, beauty with no soul. A perfect metaphor for the boy. He was a charge, nothing more, a set of parameters and protocols. It was just a job. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra to reinforce the walls of his discipline. The boy was a component in a political machine, and Kyle was a cog in that same machine. Their purposes were aligned by duty, not by choice. But as he stood there, the silent, watchful presence of Elian Vance at his back, Kyle felt an unwelcome and unfamiliar sensation, a low, protective thrum deep in his chest. It was the ancient, territorial instinct he had spent his entire life mastering. The instinct that saw something precious and fragile and wanted to stand between it and the world. He crushed it instantly, burying it under layers of training and ice-cold logic. He was a commander of the Aegis Corps. He was not some rutting beast. He was an instrument of the Directorate's will. And his will was iron. He turned, his face an impassive mask. "Your nutritional supplement will be dispensed in 10 minutes. Prepare yourself." The words were cold, clinical. They were a reminder of their dynamic. He was the guard. Elian was the prisoner. There was no room for anything else. But as he looked at the Omega, who simply nodded and moved toward the dispensing unit with a grace that was heartbreaking in its resignation, Kyle felt the first hairline crack appear in the iron of his will. This job was not an insult. It was a test, and he was suddenly, terrifyingly unsure if it was a test he could pass. He was here to contain the asset, to ensure his compliance. But the deepest, most repressed part of his being, the part he refused to acknowledge, whispered a different mission. It whispered that he was here to protect the boy, not from the world outside, but from the very cage they were both trapped in. The charity gala was an exercise in performative compassion. It was held in the Directorate's atrium, a cavernous space of white marble and holographic art, where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity. Elian stood slightly behind and to the right of his father, the designated position for a treasured accessory. He wore a suit of dove-grey silk, tailored to perfection, and his face was a mask of serene interest. Inside, he felt like he was vibrating apart. The sheer number of people, the low hum of their conversation, the cloying mix of their expensive, artificial perfumes. It was a sensory assault after the sterile silence of his suite. He focused on Kyle's back. The commander stood 10 feet away, a statue carved from shadow and duty, his storm-grey eyes constantly sweeping the crowd, missing nothing. In the 2 weeks since his arrival, Kyle's presence had become a strange constant in Elian's life. He was silent, unobtrusive, yet utterly overwhelming. He never spoke unless necessary, his voice always that low, controlled baritone. But Elian was learning to read him in other ways. The minute tensing of his shoulders when a dignitary came too close, the fractional narrowing of his eyes when a media drone hovered for longer than the approved interval. He was a fortress, and Elian was the treasure locked inside. He hated it, and yet there was a terrifying, shameful part of him that felt safe. His father was making a speech, his voice resonating with manufactured warmth as he spoke of progress and unity. Elian let the words wash over him. They were as meaningless as the sterile air he breathed every day. His gaze drifted over the crowd, the smiling faces, the predatory eyes. These were the people who bought and sold lives like his own over glasses of sparkling nutrient paste. A commotion near the atrium's main entrance drew his attention. A group of protesters had managed to bypass the outer security cordon. They were chanting, their voices a raw, angry counterpoint to the polite murmur of the gala. They held up placards with slogans he couldn't quite read. No more genetic tithes. Our children are not assets. Directorate enforcers in stark white armor were moving to contain them, but they were a chaotic, surging mass. Kyle was already moving, his body a fluid, economic line of motion. He placed himself directly in front of Elian, a human shield. His hand went to the small of Elian's back, not touching, but hovering a mere millimeter away. The heat from his palm was a scorching brand against the thin silk of the suit. "Stay behind me," Kale's voice was a low growl in his ear, meant for him alone. It was not a request. The enforcers were pushing the protesters back, their movements efficient and brutal. But one protester, a young woman with desperation etched on her face, slipped through the line. She wasn't an assassin. She wasn't a threat. She was just a mother, her face streaked with tears, and she was lunging toward the chairman, holding up a small framed photograph. "My daughter," she screamed, her voice cracking with grief. "You took my daughter." Before the other guards could react, before the enforcers could converge, she stumbled, her momentum carrying her directly toward Elian. Time seemed to slow, to stretch like heated glass. He saw the woman's wild eyes, the frantic hope and despair warring in them. He saw his father's face, a mask of cold annoyance. He saw the guards tensing, reaching for their stun batons. And then he saw Kyle. Kyle moved with a speed that was not human. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shove the woman away. In one seamless motion, he stepped into her path, shielding Elian completely with his own body, his arms coming up not to attack, but to form an unbreachable wall. His hand, the one that had been hovering, finally made contact. It pressed firmly, possessively, against the small of Elian's back, holding him in place. And then came the sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a shout. It was a noise that ripped through the curated atmosphere of the gala like a sonic boom. A deep, guttural growl that vibrated from Kyle's chest, a sound so primal and possessive it seemed to shake the very marble beneath their feet. It was the sound of a wolf standing over its kill, of a dragon guarding its hoard. It was the sound of an alpha, his control shattered, claiming what was his. The entire atrium fell silent. The protesters, the enforcers, the elite guests, everyone froze, their attention snapping to the source of that terrifying, instinctive sound. The woman stumbled back, her eyes wide with a primal fear that had nothing to do with the directorate's authority and everything to do with the predator in front of her. Kale didn't seem to notice. His entire focus was a laser beam fixed on the space the woman had occupied. His body was a rigid line of lethal intent. He was breathing heavily, the air soaring in and out of his lungs. The hand on Elian's back was a vice, his fingers digging into the muscle, branding him. Elian could feel the vibrations of that growl echoing in his own bones. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. He was terrified. He was exhilarated. In that one terrifying sound, Kale had violated every protocol he lived by. He had revealed the beast he kept so perfectly chained. He had done it to protect him. Enforcers swarmed the woman, dragging her away. Other Aegis guards formed a tight circle around them, their faces grim. The incident was over in seconds. Kale's commander, a stern-faced man named Valerius, appeared at his side, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Rask, control yourself." The word control seemed to break the spell. Kale flinched as if struck. He snatched his hand back from Ilian's back as if he'd been burned. He straightened up, his posture once again becoming the rigid, disciplined stance of an Aegis commander. But it was a lie. Elian could see the tremor in his hands, the faint sheen of sweat on his temple. The mask was back in place, but it had cracked, and Elian had seen the raging inferno beneath. Kyle turned his head slightly, his profile stark and unforgiving. His storm-grey eyes met Elian's for a fraction of a second. They were dark, turbulent, and filled with a shocking, raw emotion Elian couldn't name. It looked like fury. It looked like fear. It looked like self-loathing. "The asset is secure," Kale stated, his voice a rasp, devoid of its earlier control. "Evacuate him, now." He didn't look at Elian again. He turned, a wall of black uniform and rigid discipline, and began issuing orders. But the echo of that growl remained hanging in the air between them. It was a declaration. It was a claim. It was a catastrophic failure of his programming. And for Elian, trapped in his silent, sterile world, it was the most real thing he had ever felt. It was a promise of violence, of possession, of a protection so fierce it defied reason. And it terrified him more than any threat, because for the first time someone had looked at him and seen not an asset to be curated, but a territory to be defended. The silence in the suite after the gala was heavier, more charged than it had ever been. It was a silence filled with the ghost of a sound, the echo of a growl that had torn a hole in the fabric of their meticulously controlled world. Kale stood by the window, his back to Elian, a rigid silhouette against the city lights. He hadn't spoken a single word since they had been evacuated, his face a mask of impenetrable granite. But Elian could feel the storm raging within him. It radiated from him in waves of suppressed energy, making the air in the room crackle. "It was a calculated deterrent," Kale said suddenly, his voice flat and toneless. He was still facing the window, his reflection a pale ghost on the glass. "A tactical application of psychological pressure to neutralize a potential threat." The words were clinical, precise. They were a lie, a desperate, pathetic lie, and they both knew it. Elian remained seated on the severe modernist sofa, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He watched the commander's reflection, the unyielding line of his shoulders, the tension in his neck. "A deterrent," Elian repeated, his voice quiet but clear, letting the words hang in the air, exposing their absurdity. Kale's reflection showed his jaw clenching. The subject was emotionally unstable. A conventional approach carried a higher risk of unpredictable escalation. The chosen method was the most efficient path to de-escalation. He sounded like he was reading from an after-action report. He was trying to rationalize the irrational, to fit the primal, instinctive beast that had broken free back into the neat, orderly box of protocol, Elian felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a dangerous, reckless courage. He was tired of the lies, of the sterile performances. That growl had been the first honest thing to happen to him in years, and he would not allow it to be buried under a mountain of jargon. He decided to push. For weeks, he had been a model of compliance. Now, he wanted to see the cracks again. He wanted to see the man behind the machine. The next morning, he made his move. It was a small rebellion, almost laughably so, but in his world, it was a declaration of war. He showered, dressed, and then, with a hand that trembled slightly, he reached up and peeled off the small, transparent neutralizer patch from the skin behind his ear. He dropped it into the waste disposal unit, where it was instantly incinerated. Without the patch, the air in the suite began to change. Slowly, subtly, his own scent, suppressed for as long as he could remember, began to permeate the sterile environment. It was not a strong scent, nothing like the potent, aggressive pheromones of an alpha. It was delicate, elusive, the scent of night-blooming jasmine and cold, clean winter air, the scent of moonlight on snow. He sat at the small table where his morning nutritional paste was dispensed, and he waited. Kale entered precisely at 700 hours, his movements as predictable and precise as a clock. He stopped just inside the door, his customary 10 feet away, to deliver his morning report. The chairman has requested a... He stopped mid-sentence, his head lifted, like a wolf testing the wind. His nostrils flared just once. Elian watched him, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw the exact moment Kale registered the scent. It was not a dramatic reaction. It was something far more terrifying. It was a complete and utter cessation of movement. He froze, his body going unnaturally still. His storm-grey eyes, which were always scanning, always assessing, locked onto Elian. They widened, the pupils dilating until the grey was almost consumed by black. The air left his lungs in a silent, sharp hiss. Elian could see the struggle. He could see the war being waged behind those eyes. The commander, the machine of protocol and discipline, was fighting a losing battle against the alpha, the primal being that was being awakened by a scent it had been starved of. The tendons in Kale's neck stood out like cables. His hands, at his sides, clenched into fists so tight the knuckles turned white. He looked like a man being electrocuted, every muscle in his body rigid with a terrible, agonizing tension. "What did you do?" he finally managed to force out, his voice a raw, strangled thing, unrecognizable from his usual controlled baritone. "I seem to have misplaced my neutralizer," Elian said, his own voice betraying a slight tremor. He kept his eyes on Kale, refusing to look away. This was a test, a dangerous, foolish test. Kale took a single, involuntary step forward, then another. He was moving toward Elian, his eyes locked on him, a predator drawn by an irresistible lure. The professional distance, the 10 feet of carefully maintained protocol, was shrinking. The air between them was thick, heavy, charged with his scent and Kale's silent, violent reaction to it. He stopped less than arm's length away from the table, looming over Elian. He was breathing harshly now, his control shattering with every breath he took of the jasmine-scented air. Elian had to crane his neck to look up at him. He could feel the heat rolling off Kyle's body. He could see the fine tremor in his clenched fists. He had wanted to see the man behind the machine. Now he was seeing the beast, and it was terrifying. "The purifiers," Kyle grated out, his eyes still fixed on Elian. He didn't look away as he lifted his wrist, his fingers fumbling with the comms unit strapped there. Bridge, this is Rask. Maximize atmospheric purifiers in Habitation Suite 7. Full spectrum scrub. Now! His voice was a command ripped from his throat. Almost immediately, Elian heard the hum of the ventilation system increase, a powerful sucking sound as it began to aggressively scrub the air to tear his scent from the room. Kale stood there, rigid, until the last trace of jasmine and winter air was gone, replaced once again by the familiar, sterile nothingness. He was still breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged movements. He lowered his arm, his eyes finally breaking contact with Elian's to stare at a point on the wall just beyond his head. He looked shaken, disgusted with himself. The mask of the commander was back in place, but it was fractured, hastily reassembled. A replacement neutralizer will be issued immediately, he said, his voice clipped and harsh. This will not happen again. Your non-compliance has been noted. He turned on his heel and strode from the room, his movements stiff, angry. The door slid shut behind him, leaving Elian alone in the sudden, roaring silence. His body was trembling. He had pushed, and the man had pushed back, but not before revealing the depth of the abyss inside him. Kyle had not reacted with anger. He had reacted with something that looked like agony. He wasn't fighting Elian. He was fighting himself. And Elian, for the first time, understood the true nature of his cage. It was not just the walls and the glass. It was the system that had created both of them. Him, the object to be controlled, and Kale, the man tasked with controlling himself. And it was a system that was beginning to break. Kalen Rask felt like he was burning from the inside out. The scent. He could still taste it on the back of his tongue, a ghost of jasmine and cold, clean snow that the atmospheric purifiers couldn't erase from his memory. It had bypassed every wall, every layer of training, every ounce of his discipline, and struck him directly in the most primal, reptilian part of his brain. It had lit a fire he thought he had extinguished decades ago. He stood in the security nexus, one level below Elian's suite, staring at a bank of monitors that showed the boy from a dozen different angles. The asset, the charge. He was sitting at his table, perfectly still, his face betraying nothing. But Kyle had seen his eyes. He had seen the fear, yes, but also the defiance, the quiet, determined curiosity. The boy was testing his cage, and he had found the weakest bar was not the reinforced walls or the kinetic barriers, but the man guarding him. Kyle's report of the incident was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. Subject exhibited minor non-compliance with biochemical protocols. Situation rectified. Asset secure. He omitted the part where he had nearly lost control, where he had taken 2 steps toward the Omega, with the singular predatory intent of closing the distance, of breathing in that scent until it filled his lungs, He cut the thought off, his jaw aching from the pressure. This was unacceptable. This was a catastrophic failure. He was compromised. He should report himself, request immediate reassignment. But the thought of another guard in that room with Elian, another alpha breathing in that scent. The thought ignited a fresh wave of possessive, irrational fury. He slammed his fist onto the cool metal of the console. The guards stationed at the other end of the room flinched, but wisely said nothing. He was the commander. His control was supposed to be absolute. He needed data. He needed logic to fight the instinct that was clawing its way up his throat. He began to dig. He pulled the file on Elian's previous guard, Orson. The official report was sparse. Protocol violation, emotional compromise, reassigned to penal detail on Titan. But Kale had higher clearance. He sliced through the firewalls, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, and accessed the unabridged, encrypted incident logs. There it was. The emotional compromise was not just the blanket. The full log included Orson's biometric data from his final shift, elevated heart rate, a spike in protective pheromones. He had also filed 3 separate queries with the medical bay regarding Elian's suppressant regimen, all of which had been denied and subsequently scrubbed from the lower-level records. Orson hadn't just felt pity. He had become suspicious. He had started asking questions, and he had been removed. Kyle's blood ran cold. This wasn't a simple failure of protocol. This was a cover-up. He shifted his focus to the medical bay, specifically to the records for Elian Vance. The boy had routine checkups every 72 hours. A Dr. Aris Thorne was the signatory on all reports. The reports were pristine, filled with jargon that meant nothing. Subject maintaining optimal homeostatic balance. Suppressant efficacy at 99.7%. Kyle cross-referenced the dispensary logs for the suppressants against the chemical manifest from the Central Pharmatech labs. It took him hours of sifting through encrypted data streams, but he found it. A discrepancy. A tiny, almost insignificant alteration in the compound being delivered to Elian's suite. The primary suppressant agent was being slowly, systematically reduced, while a secondary biosynthetic estrogenic catalyst was being subtly increased. They weren't just suppressing his Omega biology. They were manipulating it. They were priming him for something. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of cold, calculated cruelty. The new guard with a reputation for absolute control. The removal of the previous guard who started asking questions. The altered medication. It was a pattern. It was a plan. Kale felt a cold, hard knot of rage solidify in his gut. This was not a protection detail. He was not a bodyguard. He was a cog in a machine that was preparing a human being for what? A transaction, a breeding. He brought up the live feed from the suite again. Elian was at the window, his forehead pressed against the glass, looking out at the city that was his prison. He looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a boy trapped and alone, and the people who were supposed to protect him were his true captors. The system Kale had served his entire life, the directorate he had killed for and bled for, was using him to facilitate this. The realization was a physical blow. The certainty of his world, the black and white clarity of duty and protocol, fractured. He was the final lock on Elian's cage, the watchdog ensuring the specimen remained pristine until it was time for delivery. A low growl rumbled in his chest, this time not one of instinct, but of cold, conscious fury. He had been played, he had been used, and he had been made complicit in something utterly vile. He looked at his own reflection in the dark screen, at the cold, impassive face of the Aegis commander. He had spent his life becoming this, a weapon, a tool, a man who followed orders without question. And for what? To end up here, the glorified warden for a victim he was helping to create. He made a decision. It was not a logical decision. It was not sanctioned by protocol. It was a choice born of the rage in his gut and the ghost of assent in his memory. He would find out the truth. He would tear this conspiracy apart, piece by piece. He would burn the whole damned system to the ground if he had to. He had been sent here to control the asset. But his mission had just changed. He would protect the boy, not the asset, the boy, from his father, from the directorate, and if necessary, from himself. The job was no longer just a job. It had become a reckoning. The pristine, controlled environment of the suite had become a pressure cooker. The air, scrubbed clean of all scent, felt thick with unspoken tension. Elian felt Kale's constant presence not as a guard, but as a hunter circling his cage. The commander was still silent, still disciplined, but something fundamental had shifted in him since the incident with the scent patch. His watchfulness was no longer passive. It was active, intense. He wasn't just observing Elian, he was studying him, his grey eyes lingering, searching for something. Elian found himself trapped in a state of hyper-awareness. He was conscious of every breath he took, every slight shift in his posture. He was acutely aware of Kyle's proximity, of the coiled energy just beneath the man's placid surface. The silence between them stretched for days, a taut wire that vibrated with everything left unsaid. The breaking point came unexpectedly. It was late, the city below a glittering tapestry of light. Elian was sketching in a datapad, a pointless exercise in creativity that was logged and analyzed by his father's staff, when the first tremor hit him. It started as a faint trembling in his hands, then spread, a cold wave that washed over his entire body. His breath hitched. The walls of the suite, which had always felt distant, suddenly seemed to be pressing in on him, the ceiling lowering, the air thinning until he couldn't draw a full breath. The sterile white of the room became blinding, the silence a deafening roar. Claustrophobia, sharp and suffocating, wrapped its icy fingers around his throat. He was going to die in this white box. He was going to suffocate on the clean, empty air. A choked gasp escaped his lips. He dropped the datapad, the clatter loud in the oppressive quiet. He curled in on himself, wrapping his arms around his knees, trying to make himself smaller, to create space where there was none. His heart was a wild, panicked drum against his ribs. He was drowning. He didn't hear Kyle move. One moment the commander was a statue by the door. The next he was kneeling in front of him. The regulation 10 feet of distance had been obliterated. Elian. Kyle's voice was low, urgent, cutting through the fog of his panic. He had never used his name before. It had always been Vance, or simply nothing at all. The sound of it, spoken in that rough baritone, was a shock that momentarily silenced the screaming in his head. Elian looked up, his eyes wide with terror. Kyle's face was inches from his. The professional mask was gone. In its place was a raw, stark concern that was more terrifying than his anger. He looked human. "Breathe," Kyle commanded, his voice soft but firm. "Match my breathing. In." He took a slow, deliberate breath, his broad chest expanding. Out. Elian tried to follow, but his lungs wouldn't obey. A ragged sob tore from his throat. He was losing control, fragmenting, the carefully constructed walls of his composure crumbling into dust. "I can't," he gasped. "The walls." Kyle's eyes held his. "There are no walls. Look at me. Just look at me." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them for a heartbeat, as if asking for permission. Then, with a decisiveness that defied all protocol, he cupped the back of Elian's neck. His touch was electric. His hand was large, warm, and impossibly steady. The calloused skin of his palm against the sensitive nape of Elian's neck sent a jolt through his entire system. It wasn't a clinical touch or a restraining one. It was grounding. It was solid. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his panic. But it wasn't enough. The room was still shrinking, the air still unbreathable. Kale seemed to realize this. His jaw tightened, a conflict playing out across his features. He was at a precipice, a choice between protocol and something else entirely. He chose the fall. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, the storm in them was unleashed. And then the scent hit Elian. It wasn't the aggressive, territorial scent of a challenging alpha. It was something else, something deep and calming, the scent of a dense pine forest after a storm, of cold stone and damp earth. It was a scent of stability, of shelter, of ancient, unshakable strength. Kale was releasing his pheromones, a controlled, deliberate act of intimacy so profound, so far beyond the pale of his duties, that it shattered Elian's panic. The scent filled the air, pushing back against the sterile nothingness, creating a pocket of reality, of life in the artificial tomb of the sweet. It wrapped around Elian like a weighted blanket, soothing the frantic trembling of his limbs, slowing the frantic beat of his heart. He inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and stone filling his lungs, chasing away the phantom suffocation. It was the scent of safety. He sagged forward, his forehead coming to rest against Kyle's shoulder, against the hard, unyielding material of his uniform. He could feel the solid muscle beneath, the steady, rhythmic beat of the man's heart. Kyle didn't pull away. His hand remained on Ilian's neck, his thumb beginning to move in a slow, hypnotic circle against his skin. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor of the white room, surrounded by a scent that spoke of forests and mountains and a world outside those walls. Kale said nothing. He simply held him, a silent, solid presence, lending him his strength, his calm, until Elian's ragged breaths evened out and the trembling stopped. When Elian finally pulled back, the panic had receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at Kale. The commander's face was grim, his eyes dark with the knowledge of the line he had just crossed. He had broken the most fundamental rule. He had not just touched his charge, he had shared his scent, a deeply personal act reserved for mates, for family. He had comforted him. He slowly withdrew his hand, the loss of contact leaving Elian's skin feeling cold and exposed. He rose to his feet, his movements stiff, putting the professional distance back between them. An anomalous biochemical surge has been detected in your system, Kale said, his voice once again clipped and formal, but with an underlying roughness it hadn't had before. The medical unit will be notified. It was another lie, a flimsy shield to cover what had just happened. They both knew it. What had happened was not medical. It was human. Elian looked at the commander, at the man who had pulled him back from the brink, who had shared his very essence to soothe him. He was no longer just a guard. He was no longer just a machine. He was Kalen Rask, and he had just irrevocably bound himself to Elian, not by duty, but by a moment of shared, desperate vulnerability. The cage was the same, but the man holding the key had just shown him that he might, possibly, know how to open the lock. The act of comfort was a declaration of war against his own conditioning. Kyle retreated to the security nexus, the scent of Elian's lingering fear and his own calming pheromones clinging to him like a shroud. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Touching the boy, soothing him, releasing his scent, It was a cascade of protocol violations that should have had him stripped of his rank and sent to the harshest penal colony in the system. Yet he felt no regret, only a cold, clarifying rage. Seeing Elian crumble, seeing the raw terror in his eyes as the pristine cage became a torture chamber, had solidified his resolve. The boy was not just being controlled, he was being systematically broken. He had to know the end game. He had to know what they were preparing Elian for. His investigation became an obsession. He pushed his neural lace to its limits, running back-channel searches, slicing through layers of directorate encryption that would have been impossible for anyone without his command-level overrides. He slept in 2-hour increments, his body fueled by stimulants and a burning, righteous fury. He was hunting, and his prey was the truth. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, his father's financial records. Chairman Vance was a man of meticulous habits and even more meticulous accounting. Cale found a series of heavily encrypted, anonymized fund transfers to a holding corporation based in the Tartarus sector. The name was a dark irony. Tartarus was a rogue system, home to pirates, mercenaries, and the brutal expansionist Thracian hegemony. The Thracians were a rival power, a society built on a rigid, militaristic interpretation of alpha-omega dynamics. Their leader, warlord Vorlag, was a notoriously cruel and ambitious alpha who collected rare omegas like trophies. The payments from Vance's corporation were coded as asset acquisition, but the flow was reversed. Vance wasn't buying, he was selling. Kyle's blood turned to ice. He cross-referenced the payment schedule with another file he managed to unearth from the chairman's private server, a file buried so deep it barely had a digital signature. It was a draft of a political treaty, an alliance between the Consolidated Directorate and the Thracian hegemony. The terms were simple. In exchange for exclusive mining rights in the Tartarus sector and a non-aggression pact, the Directorate would provide the hegemony with a good faith offering, a gesture of unity. The file contained a single addendum, a bio profile. It was Elian's. Attached was a medical protocol, written and signed by Dr. Aris Thorne. It detailed the precise chemical regimen required to reverse the effects of long-term suppressants and induce a forced, premature heat cycle in a recessive omega. The protocol was timed to perfection, designed to culminate on a specific date, 1 week from now. The date of the final payment from the Thracian hegemony. The truth was more monstrous than he could have imagined. Elian was not just a political pawn. He was the price. His own father was selling him to a brutal warlord to secure a mining deal. The suppressants weren't just for control. They were being manipulated to make him docile, to time his heat to coincide with the handover, ensuring he would be too overwhelmed by biology to resist, ensuring a quick and successful bonding with Vorlag. Kael was not his protector. He was his handler, the final guard, ensuring the merchandise remained in perfect condition until delivery. The gala, the protesters, the security breaches. It was all a fabrication, a pretext to install Kael, the unbreakable, unfeeling commander, to oversee the final, critical stage of the transaction without asking inconvenient questions like his predecessor had. The memory of Elian's panic attack, of his terrified gasp that he was suffocating, returned with sickening clarity. The boy's psyche was collapsing under the strain of his imprisonment and the subtle biochemical warfare being waged against his body. They were breaking his mind to make his body compliant. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in Kale's throat. He looked at his hands, the hands that had killed for the Directorate, that had upheld its laws. They were stained with this filth. He was complicit. He was the final instrument of this unspeakable cruelty. The rage that had been simmering in him for weeks erupted into a cold, silent inferno. The system he had dedicated his life to was not a bastion of order and progress. It was a corrupt, soulless machine that consumed its own children for profit. The iron of his will, forged in the fires of duty and discipline, was not just cracked. It was vaporized, replaced by a singular, diamond-hard purpose. He would not deliver the merchandise. He would not be a party to this. He would tear the entire contract to shreds. He would get Elian out. He shut down the console, the screens going dark, reflecting his own grim, determined face. He walked back to the lift, his stride measured, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations, escape routes, security blind spots, system reboot schedules. He was no longer thinking like a guard. He was thinking like an insurgent. He was about to declare war on the very institution he served. The lift doors opened, and he stepped back into the pristine, white corridor leading to the suite. He was walking back into the cage, but this time he was not going as its warden. He was going as its saboteur. He had to tell Elian. He had to show him the full, monstrous truth of his existence. He had to ask the boy to trust him, the man who had been his jailer, to become his only hope of salvation. The door to the suite slid open. Elian looked up from his datapad, his eyes wide and questioning. The scent of pine and stone still lingered in the air, a phantom promise of safety. Kale met his gaze, and for the first time he let the boy see past the commander. He let him see the fury, the regret, and the unwavering, terrifying resolve in his eyes. The time for lies was over. Kyle did not speak immediately. He walked to the center of the room, the space where he had knelt and held Elian through the storm of his panic, and deactivated his external comms unit. A small, almost imperceptible click was the only sound. It severed him from the Aegis network, from the constant stream of data and orders. In that moment, he was no longer Commander Rask. He was a rogue agent, a traitor. He was free. Elian watched him, his body tense, recognizing the gravity of the gesture. This was a deviation from every routine, a breach of the unshakable order that governed their lives. "They are not protecting you," Kyle said, his voice low and raw, stripped of all artifice. He finally looked at Elian, his grey eyes burning with a cold fire. "They are preparing you." Elian's breath hitched. He said nothing, his gaze locked on Kale's, waiting for the blow to fall. "Your father has made a deal with the Thracian hegemony, an alliance." Kale laid out the truth, in stark, brutal sentences, each word a hammer blow against the fragile glass of Elian's world. He spoke of Warlord Vorlag, of the mining rights, of the treaty. He spoke of the altered suppressants, the induced heat, the final horrifying purpose of his imprisonment. "You are the price, Elian, a good faith offering to seal the deal. In 1 week, they plan to hand you over." The sterile room seemed to tilt, the white walls dissolving into a nauseating blur. Elian felt the blood drain from his face, a roaring sound filling his ears. Sold. Like a thing. His own father. The man whose approval he had been conditioned to crave, whose cold distance he had always interpreted as the burden of leadership. It was not distance. It was the detachment of a merchant appraising his goods. He thought of the doctor's placid smile, the cool touch of the diagnostic instruments. He thought of the years of isolation, the performance of compliance. It had all been a lie, not a cage for his protection, but a display case, a fattening pen. No, he whispered, the word a faint puff of air, a denial against an avalanche of truth. He wouldn't. I have the treaty, Kale said, his voice unyielding. I have the medical protocols. I have the payment transfers. This is not a possibility. It is a schedule. He took a step closer, breaking the 10-foot barrier again, this time not with instinct, but with intent. The panic attacks, your failing health. It's the chemical cocktail they're pumping into you. They are destabilizing you to make you compliant for the transfer. Elian's carefully constructed world, his entire life, shattered. The pieces rained down around him, sharp and cruel. He was nothing. A commodity, a genetic sequence with a price tag. A profound, bone-deep cold settled into his marrow. It was not the fiery rage he might have expected, but a chilling, absolute despair. He had no one. He was utterly, completely alone. He looked up at Kyle, the man who had brought him this devastating news, his jailer, his handler, the final lock on his cage. And yet, he was the one telling him the truth. He was the one who had deactivated his comms. He was the one whose eyes held not the cold indifference of a guard, but the shared fury of a fellow prisoner. "Why are you telling me this?" Elian's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Your job is to deliver me." "That was my job," Kyle corrected, his voice dropping even lower. "I am making a different choice." He paused, letting the weight of his treason settle in the air between them. "I can get you out of here, but it has to be now. There is a system-wide diagnostic reboot scheduled in 2 hours. It will create a brief window, a blind spot in the network. It's our only chance. Escape." The word was alien. A concept from stories, from dreams. The idea of a world beyond this room was so vast, so terrifying, it was almost inconceivable. But the alternative, to be handed over to a brutal warlord, to have his body and mind chemically hijacked, to become a trophy, that was a fate worse than any death he could imagine. Hope, a fragile, terrifying thing, flickered to life in the frozen wasteland of his despair. It was a foolish, insane hope, pinned on the word of a man who was the living embodiment of the system that had imprisoned him. But it was all he had. He looked into Kale's stormy eyes and saw the truth of his conviction. Kale was not offering a pleasant fiction. He was offering a brutal, dangerous, and very real chance. "What do you need me to do?" Elian asked, his voice shaking but firm. A flicker of something, respect, relief, passed through Kyle's eyes. "When the time comes, you will do exactly as I say. No hesitation, no questions. Can you do that?" Elian nodded, a single, sharp movement. "Yes." "Good." Kyle began to move, his actions precise and purposeful. He went to the nutritional dispenser and began overriding its codes, ordering concentrated nutrient packs and water purification tablets. He accessed Elian's wardrobe, pulling out the most durable, dark-colored clothing he owned. Simple trousers, a thermal undershirt, soft-soled boots. He was stripping away the Omega prints and gearing up the survivor. The next 2 hours were the longest of Elian's life. They moved in near silence, a shared, unspoken understanding passing between them. Kale worked with a focused intensity, dismantling certain sensor panels, creating a small pack of supplies. He was a creature of action, of strategy. Elian, in turn, did as he was told, changing his clothes, drinking the water Kyle gave him, his mind racing. He was leaving. He was leaving the only world he had ever known. He was placing his life, his future, in the hands of this hard, silent alpha who had, for reasons Elian couldn't begin to fathom, decided to burn his own life to the ground for him. The chronometer on the wall ticked down the seconds. The appointed time drew near. Kyle came to stand before him, holding a simple, dark grey cloak. "Once we leave this room, we will not stop. We move fast, we move quiet. If I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to hide, you become a shadow. Understand?" "I understand," Elian said, his heart hammering. Kale reached out and placed a small, metallic object in his palm. It was his Aegis comms unit, the one he had deactivated. "If we get separated, press the red stud. It will emit a short-range locator, burst on a secure channel only I can track. Do not lose it." The gesture was one of profound trust. He was giving Elian a lifeline, a connection. Kyle draped the cloak over his shoulders, his fingers brushing against Elian's neck. The brief touch was grounding, a silent promise. A soft, building hum filled the room, and the lights flickered, once, twice, then went out, plunging them into the emergency twilight of the backup systems. The system-wide reboot had begun. "Now," Kyle said, his voice a low command in the sudden darkness. He took Elian's arm, his grip firm and sure. The door to the suite slid open, not onto the pristine white corridor of the residence levels, but onto a dark, narrow service shaft. Kale had rerouted the door's hydraulics. He had been planning this. He had been preparing. Elian took a deep breath of the dusty, oil-scented air of the spire's guts. It was the first different thing he had smelled in years. It smelled like freedom, and it smelled like terror. He stepped out of his cage and into the darkness, with only his former jailer to guide him. The service shaft was a vertical maze of pipes, conduits, and humming machinery, lit only by the intermittent red glow of emergency strobes. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and lubricant, a visceral contrast to the sterile nothingness of the suite. It was the smell of the spire's hidden anatomy, its mechanical guts. Kale moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, his hand never leaving Elian's arm, guiding him through the darkness. He was a shadow, completely at home in this world of metal and wires. For Elian, it was a sensory onslaught. The rough texture of the metal ladder rungs beneath his hands, the deep, resonant thrum of the spire's core vibrating through the soles of his boots, the vertigo-inducing drop into the abyss below. It was all terrifyingly, exhilaratingly real. They descended for what felt like an eternity, Kale's low voice in his ear, the only constant, issuing quiet commands. "Left foot here. Watch that steam pipe. Stay close." They emerged into a maintenance corridor, the emergency lighting casting long, distorted shadows. An alarm began to blare in the distance, a shrill, pulsing cry. The blind spot was closing. They had been discovered. "They're rebooting the security grid sector by sector," Kale said, his voice calm, devoid of panic. "They know we're gone. Now we run." And they ran. Elian's lungs burned, his legs, accustomed to a life of sedate confinement, screaming in protest. But Kale's grip was an iron band around his wrist, pulling him along, setting a pace that was punishing but sustainable. They burst through a doorway into one of the spire's lower-level commercial sectors. It was a world away from the serene opulence of the upper levels. Here, the corridors were crowded with off-duty workers and synth-food vendors, the air thick with the murmur of 100 conversations and the smell of fried protein and cheap stimulants. They were a stark anomaly, Elian in his dark, functional clothing, Kale in his severe black uniform, a predator moving through a herd of sheep. People scrambled to get out of their way. Then, a voice cut through the noise, amplified and metallic. "Commander Kalen Rask, stand down and surrender the asset. You are in violation of Directorate Aegis protocols." Enforcers, 4 of them, in their sterile white armor, blocked the corridor ahead. Behind them stood a man Elian recognized. Commander Valerius, Kale's superior, his face a mask of cold fury. Kale didn't slow down. He shoved Elian behind him. "When I move, you run for the transit platform at the end of the hall. Do not stop. Do not look back. Kale, go!" Valerius raised his hand. "Rask, don't throw your life away for an asset. The chairman is displeased, but your service record is exemplary. Surrender him, and we can contain this." Kale let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound of pure contempt. "He is not an asset." The words were a final, absolute declaration. He was no longer part of their world. He was no longer one of them. Then he moved. It was not a fight. It was a dismantling. Kale became a blur of black-clad violence. He used no weapons, only his hands, his feet, his body. He moved like a surgeon, his strikes precise, disabling, and brutally efficient. An elbow to a throat, a knee to a joint, a palm heel strike to a helmet that sent an enforcer crashing to the ground. It was over in 5 seconds. 4 armored bodies lay groaning on the floor. Only Valerius was left standing, his face pale with shock and fury. Kyle turned to Elian, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes blazing with adrenaline. "Run!" Elian ran. He sprinted past the fallen enforcers, past the stunned onlookers, his gaze fixed on the transit platform. He could hear the sounds of a fight behind him, the thud of blows, a grunt of pain. He didn't look back. He trusted Kale. He reached the platform just as a maglev shuttle was preparing to depart, its doors sliding shut. He threw himself through the gap, landing hard on the shuttle's floor. The doors hissed closed behind him, and the shuttle accelerated, pressing him back against the wall. He scrambled to the window, his heart in his throat. He saw Kale disarm Valerius, sending the man's pulse rifle skittering across the floor. But more enforcers were pouring into the corridor. Kale was outnumbered. He looked up, his eyes finding aliens through the shuttle's window. He gave a short, sharp nod, a command. "Get out." Then he turned and plunged back into the fight, a one-man army holding back the tide to buy Elian a few more seconds of freedom. The shuttle plunged into a tunnel, and the scene was cut off. Elian was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He was alone, rocketing towards the unknown, towards the sprawling, chaotic undercity he had only ever seen from his window. He clutched the Aegis comms unit in his hand, his thumb hovering over the red stud. Kale had told him to use it if they were separated, but using it would also give away his own position. He had a choice: trust that Kale would find him, or try to save himself. He thought of Kale's eyes as he faced down his own commander. He is not an asset. He thought of the scent of pine and stone, the feeling of safety in the middle of a panic attack. He thought of the fierce, protective growl at the gala. Kale had thrown away his entire life for him. He would not betray that sacrifice by panicking now. He would be a shadow, just as Kale had told him. The shuttle finally decelerated, its doors opening onto a scene of controlled chaos. This was the Undercity terminus, a vast, grimy cavern teeming with people. The air was a thick soup of smells, unfiltered exhaust, damp concrete, unfamiliar spices, and the overwhelming scent of thousands of unneutralized bodies. It was a sensory overload that made him dizzy. For the first time in his life, he was anonymous. He was just another face in the crowd. He pulled the hood of his cloak up, lowered his head, and melted into the river of humanity. The cold metal of the comms unit, a solid, reassuring weight in his hand. He was terrified. He was free. He would wait for Kyle. He would be a shadow. He would survive. And he would hope. The Undercity was a living, breathing organism of steel, smoke, and humanity. It was everything the upper levels were not. Loud, chaotic, organic, and brutally, viscerally alive. Elian found a secluded alcove in the sprawling market district, a space between a noodle stall venting clouds of savory steam and a merchant selling scavenged tech parts. He huddled in the shadows, his cloak pulled tight, trying to make himself invisible. For the first time, he was surrounded by the full spectrum of human scent, the sharp tang of an alpha haggling over prices, the soft, milky scent of an Omega mother hushing her child, the neutral, earthy sense of betas going about their work. It was overwhelming, but it was also a strange comfort. It was the scent of life, unfiltered and unmanaged. He was a ghost in this world, a creature of the sterile spire, adrift in a sea of raw existence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every loud noise made him flinch. He clutched the comms unit, his lifeline, his symbol of faith in the man who had set him free. Hours bled into one another. The market crowds swelled and then thinned as the Undercity's dim, artificial day cycled into its equally dim night, marked only by the shifting colors of the holographic advertisements that flickered on the grimy walls. Despair began to creep in, a cold, insidious tendril. What if Kyle didn't make it? What if he was captured? Or worse? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut. He was alone, a helpless boy in a dangerous world, with no skills, no currency, no allies. He was just starting to let the true hopelessness of his situation wash over him when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He gasped, spinning around, his body tensing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. A man stood there, shrouded in the shadows. He was large, imposing. Then the man stepped forward into the flickering neon light. It was Kale. He was battered, bruised, his perfect black uniform torn and stained. There was a fresh, deep cut over his right eyebrow, and his face was a grim mask of exhaustion. But he was there. He was alive. Elian felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He didn't say a word, just stared, drinking in the sight of him. "I told you to be a shadow," Kale said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You did well." He looked different. The rigid discipline of the Aegis commander was gone, replaced by the weary, dangerous stillness of a survivor. He had shed his old skin in the fire of their escape. "I thought," Elian started, his voice choked. "I know," Kyle said, cutting him off gently. "But I'm hard to kill." He gave Elian a quick, assessing look. "Are you all right?" Elian just nodded, unable to speak. Kyle's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, wiped a smudge of grime from Elian's cheek with his thumb. The contact was brief, but it sent a shockwave of warmth through Elian's cold fear. "Come on," Kyle said, his voice back to its commanding tone. "We can't stay here." He led Elian away from the market, down a labyrinth of narrow, winding alleys far from the main thoroughfares. They moved in silence, Kale's presence a solid shield against the chaos of the Undercity. Finally, they stopped before a heavy, rusted metal door marked with a faded, barely visible symbol of a stylized gear. Kyle knocked a complex, rhythmic pattern on the door. After a moment, a slot slid open, and a pair of suspicious eyes peered out. "I'm looking for Ren," Kale said. The eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "Tell her. Rask is cashing in a favor from the Cygnus Prime campaign." The name seemed to be a key. The slot slammed shut, and a series of heavy bolts were thrown. The door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit workshop filled with the scent of soldering fumes and machine oil. A woman stood in the doorway. She was wiry and tough, her face smudged with grease, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked Kale up and down, her gaze lingering on his torn uniform, then shifting to Elian, who was half hidden behind him. "Rask," she said, her voice dry. "You look like hell, and you brought a stray." "Ren," Kyle acknowledged with a nod. "We need a place to disappear for a while." Ren's sharp eyes assessed Elian again, taking in his fine-boned features, his clean, though now grimy, clothes, the terrified but defiant look in his eyes. "This isn't a stray," she said, her voice softening slightly. "This is trouble from the top floor." "The worst kind," Kyle agreed. Ren sighed, running a hand through her short, dark hair. "The favor from Cygnus was a big one. Get in. But if the enforcers come knocking, you're on your own." They stepped inside, and the heavy door boomed shut behind them, the bolts sliding home, sealing them off from the Undercity. Ren led them to a small, clean room in the back of the workshop. It contained 2 simple cots, a small table, and a single, bare light bulb. It was the most beautiful room Elian had ever seen. "Food is in the ration locker. The fresher is through there. Don't make a lot of noise," Ren said. Then she turned to leave, pausing at the door. "It's good to see you alive, Kale. I heard you went career suicide." "It was a necessary course correction," Kale said. Ren grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. And then she was gone, leaving them alone. The silence in the small room was profound. They were safe, for now. Elian finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for hours. He sank onto one of the cots, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Kyle watched him for a moment, then went to the ration locker, returning with a nutrient bar and a bulb of water. He handed them to Elian. "Eat." Elian took them, his fingers clumsy. As he ate, Kyle began to tend to his own injuries, cleaning the cut on his face with a practiced, detached efficiency. They were no longer guard and charge. The rigid hierarchy of their past life had dissolved in the violence of their escape. Here, in this small, safe room, they were just 2 people. Survivors. Equals. When he was done, Kyle sat on the other cot, the space between them filled with a new, uncertain intimacy. "My father," Elian began, the words tasting like poison. "Will he hunt us?" "He won't stop," Kyle said, his voice grim. "Losing you isn't just a political failure. It's a personal insult, and the hegemony will not be pleased. We are not just fugitives. We are a diplomatic incident." The reality of their situation was bleak. They had escaped the cage, only to find themselves in a much larger, more dangerous prison. The entire world was hunting them. Elian looked at Kale, at the exhausted lines on his face, the bruises darkening on his skin. "Why?" he asked, the question that had been burning in him since Kale had first spoken the truth. "Why did you do it? You lost everything." Kale was silent for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his storm-grey eyes were clear, his expression stripped of all its former masks. "My entire life has been about following orders," he said, his voice quiet, almost raw. "About serving a system I believed in. That system was going to destroy an innocent person for profit. They were going to use me to do it. There are some orders a man cannot follow and still call himself a man." He held Elian's gaze. "It wasn't just a job," he said, the words a quiet confession, an admission of the lie he had been telling himself from the beginning. "It was wrong, and I couldn't be a part of it." In that moment, Elian saw the true man. Not the cold commander or the brutal warrior, but Kalen Rusk, a man of profound, if buried, integrity. A man who had chosen a person over a system. He reached across the small space between the cots and, with a tentative hand, touched the back of Kyle's wrist. Kyle flinched at the unexpected contact, but didn't pull away. His skin was warm, solid, real. "Thank you," Elian whispered. It was all he could say. It was everything. Kale simply nodded, his throat working. He turned his hand over and slowly curled his fingers around Elian's, his large, calloused hand enveloping his. The contact was an anchor, a silent pact. They were in this together. Fugitives, allies. The future was a terrifying, unknown darkness. But for the first time in his life, Elian was not facing it alone. He had a hand to hold. And in the dim light of the hidden room, surrounded by the scent of metal and oil and the quiet, steady presence of the man who had saved him, that was enough. It was hope.